and welcome to the Oddity Archive, the show that honors comedy by dryly blabbing on about it. Anyway, today's episode was supposed to be one of my networkism episodes, like TBS networkisms, and this one was going to be on Comedy Central. But sure enough, it devolved into one of my now patented rabbit hole topics. So, for the uninitiated, Comedy Central was actually the merger between two existing comedy-minded cable channels. And in researching this, I found myself way more interested in those two predecessor channels, and there was more than enough material to make an episode on just that, so yeah, I shifted gears. And with that, let's take a look back at Comedy Central before Comedy Central. If you're watching this video, you're probably plenty familiar with a little channel called MTV. Back in 1989, MTV was still predominantly associated with music videos. With this in mind, this was the year that HBO decided that there needed to be an equivalent channel for comedy, complete with, if you will, VJs and a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week schedule. As such, on May 16th, 1989, HBO announced The Comedy Channel, on the eve of that year's Cable Television Association convention. As it turned out, MTV, strangely enough, wanted to launch their own comedy cable channel, a little thing simply known as Ha. We'll get back to that.
Right after the show. Okay, coming up next, one of my favorite film shorts. It's called Cow Cow Boogie. Check it out and ask yourself, are those cows really singing?
As I mentioned, the initial idea was for the Comedy Channel to more or less function as a comedy equivalent to MTV, largely catering to the same demographics as MTV. The Comedy Channel's CJs, comedy jockeys, would host usually 3-hour daily blocks of stand-up comedy segments, movie clips supplied by HBO, of course, partial or sometimes complete episodes of usually so bad they're good 50s and 60s TV shows, ancient short subject films, complete movies with periodic host segments, and most famously, complete movies with running commentary.
Oh, that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. Wait, stop, cut this. Look, I can't, Maximilian, come in, I can't do it. I can't do this.
I was moved.
The Comedy Channel debuted at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, November 15th, 1989, to reportedly around 6 million homes. The first show was known as The Sweet Life, hosted by hybrid teen idol cult rocker turned actress comedienne Rachel Sweet, who we've had our little run-ins with on this show, haven't we?
You guys, this is really getting cruel. This is like... All right, here I am at 16. Here I am at 20.
In researching this episode, one thing I ran into over and over digging through period issues of Broadcasting Magazine was that most cable systems weren't exactly sold on the idea of an all-comedy cable channel. While the Comedy Channel did indeed launch to, reportedly, around 6 million households, there were about 53 million households in the US with cable TV in 1989. Rather appropriately, on April Fool's Day 1990, Viacom's competitor to the Comedy Channel launched, namely Ha. That same month, Time Warner, home to HBO, and Viacom, home to MTV, entered talks to merge the two channels. The initial round of talks failed around June, probably due to an unrelated ongoing antitrust lawsuit against Viacom. But regardless, both parties still seemed interested in a merger, just at a different time. As such, both networks seemed to put a freeze of sorts on their programming. To the best of my knowledge, the only new show on the Comedy Channel after that point was a lame, dad joke-laden ESPN Sports Center parody called Sports Monster.
Everyone knows professional athletes and coaches supplement their income with endorsements and personal appearances. But Chicago Bulls head coach Phil Jackson has taken a unique approach. Jackson, a lifelong admirer of legendary ventriloquist Edgar Bergen, will be touring the country with his nutty buddies Knucklehead Jordan and Naughty Pippen.
Comedy is our middle name. Channel is our last name.
The final year or so of the Comedy Channel's run appears to be rather uneventful. About as major a change as it saw was a move towards a more traditional schedule with fewer MTV-styled blocks and more full self-contained shows, and increasingly more third-party shows at that. Also, if the only surviving program guides from March of 1991 are anything to go by, it appears that the Comedy Channel had consolidated its programming into something of an 8-hour block, just with minor changes in each of that day's 3 run-throughs. Well, this is frustrating. Upon the Comedy Channel's launch, some 10 hours or so of every broadcast day was hosted by comedian Mike Farrow as his stand-up comedy persona, Tommy Sledge P.I. Frustrating because, for someone that got as much screen time as he did in the network's early days, I can't find a single excerpt of his shows, just a few stray promos. Anyway, Sledge was known for being an exaggerated version of the stereotypical 1940s film noir-styled private investigator. Within the realm of the Comedy Channel, his hosting duties seem to consist of hosting MTV-styled blocks of mostly stand-up comedy clips, as well as being the channel's primary movie host. Sledge also seemed to be the first person to get the axe from the Big Cheese, the head honcho, first having his airtime reduced to only a few hours, then vanishing completely from the Comedy Channel after about 6 months. Anyway, getting back to those stray promos, Sledge seemed to almost be a station mascot of sorts, eternally trying to investigate all that is the world of comedy. I'd love to see more of his regular shows surface, if only to, well, investigate further.
A diamond so big it needed a dimmer switch. She said, thanks, bye. Then she angled it, lammed it, split, moved on, pounded her dogs, beat her boats, motored her movies, used our apartment as a launching pad for anywhere else USA. She's just a cent on the air. History, a highlight film, a footnote in the archives.
Hey, now where am I? It was Sledge. I don't know what it is now.
You're watching Night After Night. I'm Alan Havey. Obviously, we have run out of things to do. We'll be right back.
Stand-up comedian Alan Havey was the Comedy Channel's resident, well, late-night guy. While Havey did run an assortment of usually stand-up comedy clips, the real attraction was Havey himself. His eternally grumpy persona may or may not have been an act, I'm really not sure. But he strikes me as someone that thinks he should be taking over for the likes of Johnny Carson or David Letterman, but just wasn't likable enough to get by. And was an even worse interviewer than Carson or Letterman.
Things at the bottom of the screen making fun of the movie, that's how you know it's our show.
And this really happened to you, didn't it?
Getting shot into space?
I mean, it's not just something goofy you made up. You really got shot into space, didn't you? Tell us about that.
Well, I never got shot into space.
I'm just funning you.
Okay.
Now, how did you come up with this idea? Because everybody sits around at home and like makes fun of bad movies, but
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say.
Give me that. There are no tears tonight. There's no more frog. Open that window. Move. Throwing it out the window. Hi, Elizabeth. How are you? He's gonna jump! He's gonna jump! He's out the window! There he goes! Oh. He's dead! That's it! No more puppets.
Hey, welcome to the show. Got a lot of great stuff lined up for you today on the show for you. Supercar, we got Clutch Cargo, we've got Joe McDoakes, and I will be catching a bullet in my teeth.
Des Moines, Iowa-based trio The Higgins Boys, Steve and Dave, and Gruber, Dave Allen, and no, not the at-large guy, had earned a decent following as a live act, so much so that they were able to tour. While doing a show in LA, fellow comedian and fellow Comedy Channel stalwart Joel Hodgson latched onto the trio and helped develop a loose premise for one of the then as yet unlaunched Comedy Channel's programming blocks. The guys sit around in their presumptive bachelor pad and do the odd sketch and introduce primarily episodes of forgotten TV shows and various, often public domain, short subjects, including Clutch Cargo cartoons. Those freaking nerds.
It's a Comedy Channel presentation.
That is what I call vigilante frontier justice in the style that only Clutch can do.
How'd it go with the sniper?
How'd it
go? A little frontier justice.
Whoa, so you and Clutch are the dolers out of frontier justice.
Pardon?
Kind of like Judge Jim Roy being...
I found exactly one complete-ish episode of The Higgins Boys and Gruber, and it's perfectly all right. The guys play well off of each other, the humor is loaded with absurdist non-sequiturs, and it all goes well with the Z-grade material they run. The few scattered sketches were perfectly decent, and so on and so on. Speaking of sketches, the boys did have a half-hour special for HBO in 1991, it's on YouTube, and finds them running through some of their existing sketches in a live setting. And it's well worth a watch. That same year, there was also a pilot for a regular half-hour sketch show, which, despite not getting picked up, did air. And like all sketch comedy shows, it's hit and miss. Perhaps tellingly, the three went their separate ways after Comedy Central launched.
Could you clear a path, people, please? Let the man through.
Since then, Dave Higgins has appeared on numerous sitcoms, most famously Malcolm in the Middle. Steve Higgins has since become Jimmy Fallon's regular announcer and sidekick, and of course, Dave Gruber Allen is better known these days for his appearances on Freaks and Geeks and for his naked trucker persona.
And I should be delighted to confound him with scientific facts that he declared were impossible.
As a nice segue from the Higgins Boys and Gruber, let's take a brief look at Joel Hodgson's primary contribution to the Comedy Channel. Of course, that would be far and away the network's most lasting show, Mystery Science Theater 3000. And I mean lasting. It was one of only a precious few shows to survive the transition from the Comedy Channel to Comedy Central, and the only show to manage any real longevity. There are already tons of retrospectives on this movie-riffing enterprise, some from the original crew, no less, so I'll simply say that Oddity Archive and so many others at least partially owe their existence to the old satellite of love.
So don't miss the next exciting episode of Mystery Science Theater 3000. It would be unfashionable.
Oh, my shoes are untied. Oh.
Coming up
on Short Attention Span Theater, John Lovitz, Elaine Boozler, Ellen Cleghorn, The Kids in the Hall.
Short Attention Span Theater was the last of the Comedy Channel's MTV-styled blocks, and in my opinion, the least. Initially, there was no host to this show. It was just the network's equivalent to MTV running on autopilot at off hours. Over time, the show, or a programming block, did go through a long line of actual hosts. A pre-Daily Show Jon Stewart, stand-ups Patty Rossborough, Mark S. Allen, and finally Mark Marone, with a revolving door of guest hosts in between. If there's anything unique to Short Attention Span Theater, it's that it folded in entertainment news along the way, a la MTV News. Otherwise, the third-party clips are just mostly stand-up comedy clips. The show survived the transition to Comedy Central, where Saturday Night Live and Kids in the Hall sketches were folded in. Short Attention Span Theater managed to last until 1994.
Welcome. I'm Alan King, comedian. And tonight, we enter the comedy mind of Gary Shandling.
I have an intimacy problem as it is. Suddenly, you're into my mind?
The historian in me loves the apparent final two shows, Sports Monster notwithstanding, to be developed by the Comedy Channel. The first of these shows was Inside the Comedy Mind, hosted by Borscht Belt legend Alan King. It's the comedy equivalent of Inside the Actors Studio, which was actually still a few years away. Anyway, in short, each episode is a dedicated half-hour chat with either a stand-up comic or comic actor, and yes, I realize the twain often meet. Unlike a lot of the other Comedy Channel shows, there's less of a tendency towards belabored cynicism and being on all the time, and just letting the comics chat for a while.
Tired of seeing stand-up
Saturation.
and there
and
isn't.
And the brick wall. If I see, I don't know what the brick wall represents.
The brick wall just represents a dead end that most of the guys are on.
Do you go to comedy clubs? Do you see other comedians? Do you have any reason or any need to?
No.
Alan King, unsurprisingly, was a good, sympathetic host, and as such, one that other comics seem to be at ease around. Not that there's no laughs to be had here. I mean, everyone still gets in their funny stories and little jabs along the way, but it really feels more like just getting to sit around and share a drink with a few generations worth of comics. Alas, the show did not survive the transition to Comedy Central, though a few reruns did air.
Hello, I'm Robert Klein, and this week on Dead Comic Society, we've got Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin. Dead Comic Society, the Comedy Channel's home for the all-time greats of comedy. I'll see you there.
Dead Comics Society was the all-comedy equivalent to what the AMC network was doing at the time. Simply show a classic movie with wraparound host segments. Whereas AMC had Bob Dorian to host, Dead Comics Society had stand-up legend Robert Klein hosting cherry-picked silence and early talkies. Klein proves to be a knowledgeable and loving fan of the classics, not providing too much in the way of wisecracks, but instead largely letting the movies speak for themselves. Alas, there is very little footage circulating as of this episode, but I really enjoyed what I saw. Frustratingly, like Inside the Comedy Mind, this did not survive the transition to Comedy Central.
Oh! What? Launch.
And here's where it gets less interesting, and a lot shorter. For exactly 1 year, the Comedy Channel's competitor was simply known as Ha. I guess the best analogy for Ha would be if the Comedy Channel was MTV, then Ha was VH1. One more for the younger demographic, one more for the oldsters. There isn't much of a history lesson to give here, but I'll do my best. Ha debuted on April Fool's Day 1990 with a temporary defacing of the actual Hollywood sign to promote the new channel. The sign now reading Hollywood. It was probably the funniest thing to ever come out of the network. I'd be remiss if I didn't at least touch on the station's bumpers, quite creative ones at that. While each bumper, some doubling as show promos, go in some very different directions, each one ends as if they were a whole new variation of the network logo, a la MTV, which would make sense, it was some of the same people. I personally especially enjoyed the bumpers with, of all people, Mel Torme.
I'll pay my taxes, I'll be happy if I can sit here now and just watch Ha.
Whereas the Comedy Channel emphasized stand-up comedy and original programming, Ha was primarily about the reruns. As in, let's clear the rights to as many old TV comedies as possible and see what sticks. The flagship show for Ha was Saturday Night Live. Not new episodes or anything, but they did have clearance to show any episode made as of early 1990. Most SNL reruns at the time were only the 1975 to 80 episodes. I was only able to find one partial TV listing from the first day of Ha, and sure enough, SNL was the first thing I saw, at 4 p.m. Prime time was 100% late 60s through mid 70s fare like The Lucy Show, Love American Style, Rhoda, and a precious few other similar shows. Having said that, over time, Ha did start folding in some newer imports like London Underground and the original British Whose Line Is It Anyway? In an effort to get Ha onto more cable systems, Viacom offered the ability to split Ha with VH1, 12 hours a day for each channel. From what I can gather, by doing so, you would only be allowed to split the channel for up to 2 years. Then the cable operator must take VH1 and Ha full time. Evidently, this incentive didn't work. Ha only launched to 4 million households, compared to the Comedy Channel's almost as unimpressive 6 million. To wrap things up, just in time for Christmas, Time Warner and Viacom came to an agreement on a merger to take place sometime in 1991. Now, remember when I mentioned that Viacom was involved in an antitrust lawsuit? That lawsuit was with Time Warner, as in Time Warner was suing Viacom. For what it's worth, it took until the summer of 1992, but the antitrust lawsuit was settled out of court. If Ha's own hype was to be believed, the channel intended to consist of 25% original programming. Ha intended to launch its first original shows in May of 1990, but to the best of my research, only 3 ever came to pass. This first one is another one where there's only one incomplete, still circulating episode. This show was called The Unnaturals. This was Ha's stab at a sketch comedy show. To its credit, it's considerably heavier and more stylized than what I would have expected out of Ha, but that's about where my praise of it ends. If the one partial episode I found was anything to go by, it doesn't look like much. Special guest Dennis Leary pretty well carries the whole thing, and for nothing at that. I should also note that as of my making this, Leary's IMDb page doesn't even acknowledge this show. Amusingly, reruns of this were still being aired after the ultimate transition to Comedy Central, with the final known airing taking place in 1993.
I don't want to see any tears on my princess.
After Drive was Ha's stab at a late-night talk show. This show was co-hosted by future Veep producer Billy Kimball and Dennis Leary. And this isn't listed on Dennis's IMDb page either. Or Billy Kimball's, for that matter. There's about 8 minutes of an episode of this on YouTube, and it's thoroughly unremarkable.
Did you ever grow anything really strange? I mean, with fertilizers and such?
What was that? I think we got a pig attack going on in the back there. Oh, no, a pig is eating the director. Oh, this is horrible.
To close things out, let's take a quick look at the only game show to ever come out of Ha or the Comedy Channel. This show was called Clash, and was hosted by Billy Kimball. Apparently Ha only had 2 people on their regular payroll. Anyway, the basic premise was to put teams of seeming natural enemies against each other. For example, pitting insurance claim adjusters against car accident victims. As of my making this, there's only one, thankfully complete, episode of this show circulating. While there is some mildly amusing snark and the tantalizing possibility of an easy question for the game's winner's circle round, it really is a pretty standard quiz show. The trivia is pretty mid-level, nothing too hard, nothing too basic. The currently circulating episode is actually a rerun from after Ha's demise, but before the true launch of Comedy Central. And with that in mind, let's move on to this episode's final chapter.
Foxtrot Lima Echo. Audience? Rifle! Okay.
Here's the kind of mind-bending question you can expect from Clash.
How many wedgies were you personally responsible for in high school?
Oh, Clash. Weeknights at 7 on CTV.
Appropriately, on April Fool's Day 1991, the Comedy Channel and Ha finally merged, ending Ha right at the 1-year anniversary of its launch. Let's just say the merger/relaunch of the 2 comedy channels was uninspired. The channel bumpers were now simply static slides of some absurdist postcard mock-ups. The channel promos were largely the same ones from the Comedy Channel, just now with slightly modified voiceovers. And most tellingly, the new network opted to keep the emphasis on the reruns. This new network was known as CTV, the Comedy Network. Comedy Television, the Comedy Network. Also, never mind that major Canadian network that can often be seen in the US's northern bordering states.
Chaplin, Field, Lloyd, Keaton, Benchley.
About as unique as CTV got was that it carried over reruns of some of the now canceled Comedy Channel shows like Dead Comics Society, which, to the best of my knowledge, were completely dropped either with the final transition to Comedy Central or soon thereafter. Also, to the best of my knowledge, there were no shows exclusive to or originated by CTV. As one might expect, that certain Canadian network wasn't too thrilled about a second CTV in existence. So in true stereotypical Canadian fashion, Canadian CTV sent Time Warner a letter of concern, not a cease and desist or any other legal thing. Unsurprisingly, the powers that be agreed and opted to rename their operation to Comedy Central, which allowed them to truly start a new chapter. CTV, the comedy network, gave way to Comedy Central on June 1st, 1991, a mere 2 months after the big Comedy Channel merger.
Comedy Central.
Well, that's it for today's archive. You have been watching Oddity Archive. You are watching Oddity Archive. You will continue to watch Oddity Archive. And coming up next, an old Gallagher stand-up special.
Hi, I'm Johnny Depp, and this is what my hair looks like without grease. You're watching
Oddity Archive.
Ladies and gentlemen, Gallagher goes melon crazy.